Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 177 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and over 300 partnering organizations from all over the world that have come together during this pandemic. We were formed in the spring of last year and launched in May to provide an open space for people worldwide to come together to share their experiences and their perspectives, their solutions, their hopes, their dreams, their visions of how humanity can use the crisis of the pandemic as an opportunity for renewal and a greater alignment with the larger ecological system within which we find ourselves. Let us begin today, as we always do, with a moment of heart coherence. Let us take a few deep breaths, settle into our bodies, close our eyes, and place our attention on our hearts. See if you can slow down far enough and long enough to listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of deep gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive. We're alive at this extraordinary, critical moment in the human journey, when every choice we make counts in the determination of our future. Listen to your heartbeat. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart, a grateful heart for all of you who've joined our program today, I want to begin our session with a reflection on Alvin Toffler's seminal book, written in the 1970s, called Future Shock. I remember I was a doctoral student at Cambridge University, and I read his book, and it was the first time that I began to reflect that human reality was changing so radically that the question of whether we were going to survive indefinitely into the future arrested my attention. Toffler, in the book Future Shock, said that from time immemorial, generation after generation of human beings, and it's been estimated that there's been about 10,000 generations of human beings in the last 250,000 years or so, since humans have been basically like we are today. For about 250,000 years, people have been as intelligent, as emotionally aware, as physically capable, as strategically astute, as communally and socially oriented as we are today. And over the thousands and thousands of years, we began to develop slowly, incrementally, a momentum that began to accelerate until about 75 years ago. We reached a threshold that changed the world as we know it. And the best way to understand it is just to think through the thought experiment. If you start, you all know what a chessboard looks like. 8 squares times 8 squares, 64 squares. If you start in the lower right, lower left square, and you put 1 grain of rice, and you move to the next square and you double it, and then you double it, and then you double it, and then you double it. By the time you get to that 64th square on the far upper right, you've got almost an infinite number of grains of rice. And that's what's happened to humanity. And what Alvin Toffler observed, he says we are now, by the 1970s, moving so fast, accumulating knowledge and accelerating technology at such a speed that quite literally the future is coming into the present for the first time in the human journey. It's no longer the past trundling along and we're in this present that is stretching endlessly before us. It's the case now that we're all experiencing future shock. And that's actually inhibiting our capacity to respond. And he said that the greatest challenge that humanity had, this was back in the 1970s, is how do we change our moral awareness and consciousness to keep up with the speed of change? And then something happened with inside that. You know, Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, that founded AMD, one of the giants, the pioneers of Silicon Valley in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, said that technology would double every 18 months. Well, again, back to the chessboard. It doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled until finally, according to observers, in about 2007, 2008, we hit that upper right-hand square of the chessboard, and human knowledge and technology exploded into hyper complexity at a level and at a pace and at an impact that is assaulting humanity's capacity to respond. And that was the year the iPhone came out. That was the year Facebook. That was a turning of exponential speed. Now, with you combine that with the fact that humanity, as it was accelerating, was not uplifting its consciousness, but continuing those trends, at the heart of which was the desecration of the environment and climate change and global warming and a range of global crises spinning out of control simultaneously with this explosion of exponential knowledge and technology, such that knowledge, what they say today, in February 2021, is doubling every 12 and a half minutes. And then we get COVID. How are we to understand the chaos that the momentum of our behavior, the acceleration of what we've created, is producing in the world at large, and the challenge that it confronts us with as we seek, as mere mortals, basically the same as we were 250,000 years ago, in a world that is now spinning literally out of control. In a decade in which scientists are now telling us that this exponential explosion, at the center of which is radical increases in climate change and other species extinctions and the decimation of our biodiversity, is challenging us in ways that we've never experienced. And we have about 10 years to sort it out, maybe less. So the question that we've been probing in Humanity Rising, as I said at the beginning, how do we use the crisis of the pandemic, the crisis of climate change, the crisis of species extinction, the crisis of overpopulation, the crisis of poverty, of racism, as an opportunity for human renewal? That's the $64,000 question in my mind. Changing consciousness proportional to the challenge. If we can do that, we will be remembered forever as that generation that uplifted our species. 250,000 years in, to a level that we ensured the ongoing possibility of being human in a more abundant, sustainable, regenerative, resilient way, and ensured unto our children, unto the 7th generation, the kind of abundance that all of us know is possible if we would just raise our consciousness. So it's with great pleasure today, in fact, with a sense of feeling privileged, that I want to introduce you to Carolyn Baker, who was a psychotherapist for many, many years, 17 years, I believe, and then a professor of psychology for 10 years. She's written 13 books. And I would say, of all the authors I know, Carolyn Baker has spent more time contemplating the question that I just posed. If you distill it down, it's how do we navigate through chaos with a purpose of regeneration. In fact, her last book with Andrew Harvey is called Radical Regeneration. We talked about it a few months ago when Carolyn and Andrew were with us on Humanity Rising. And so I asked Carolyn to rejoin us to really speak to us from her heart about how we create islands of sanity in a rising sea of chaos, with a view and with an intent of galvanizing the kind of regenerativity in our psyches, souls, and hearts that will enable us to move into the future with the kind of abundance we know is possible. So, Carolyn, I want to welcome you back to Humanity Rising and turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. What a joy and pleasure to look forward to these sessions. And I love your meditations and your speaking afterward as we come together to consider this incredibly relevant and scary and joyful possibility. So, what I want to talk about this morning is how we develop islands of sanity in seas of chaos. Last month, the world was relieved to say goodbye and good riddance to Donald Trump as the President of the United States. And while this was a huge advance for humanity and it removed one sea of chaos, many others yet remain. Climate chaos, a global pandemic, racial injustice, authoritarianism, and economic inequality are still very much with us. We might have removed Trump from the most powerful office in the world, but we're now faced with chaos that didn't begin with him and won't be resolved by new policies. While it's crucial to strengthen our activism around these issues, we need to have specific tools for navigating the chaos of our individual lives and in our communities. We need to marry our activism with grounded spirituality and robust practices that support awakeness, discernment, and that create islands of sanity in an insane world. And actually, echoing much of what Jim said is the poet Rumi from the 13th century, many hundreds of years ago, whose words are as relevant to us now as they were then, perhaps even more. As he writes that poem that I'm sure most of you have heard before, The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Essentially, what Jim was telling us is that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And when we think about the seas of chaos, it's almost impossible not to feel overwhelmed. It's been helpful for me to reframe these and other seas of chaos in terms of a rite of passage or an initiatory ordeal for humanity. A rite of passage is a ceremony existing in all ancient and traditional societies that marks the passage from one developmental, social, or religious status to another. And these rites continue still to this day in some places. In ancient cultures, young people were prepared from birth to participate in a rite of passage near the age of puberty, which would mark their transition from childhood to adulthood. And it almost always involved a physical ordeal somewhere in nature, followed by a celebration and a welcoming from the community. Now, there were three essential aspects of the rite of passage that have been identified by scholars of the ritual. The first was a vision of possibility. From birth and through childhood, a young person was prepared for his or her rite of passage. And a key aspect of the preparation, of course, is understanding why they need the rite, why do this in the first place, and what it can help them accomplish in their life and for the community. The second aspect was the ordeal, which was a set of physical or emotional challenges that caused them to descend into the psyche and the depths of their humanity to discover transcendent resources that would carry them through the ordeal and cause them to experience firsthand the power of their deeper, authentic self or soul. And finally, there was the homecoming and celebration, which allowed the young person to find their place in the community. The community saw this initiation as a gift to the community. And from that gratitude, enormous celebrations were conducted that may have gone on for days. Now, of course, modern cultures have some rites of passage, such as the quinceañera or the bat or bar mitzvah. But these rituals are residual fragments of formal rites of passage from traditional cultures in which longer, more comprehensive procedures involve not only celebration, but opportunities for the young person to engage in deep introspection and contemplation, particularly in nature. Now, while modern rites of passage or modern cultures no longer have rites of passage, older indigenous and traditional cultures believed that they were necessary. The initiation always involved some type of ordeal that not only required endurance and physical and emotional strength, but also compelled the young person to reach down inside themselves to discover a deeper identity. In other words, the ordeal revealed to them that they're more than a mind or an ego, that they are a spiritual, eternal being. Indigenous cultures are alive and evolving in the 21st century, but many aspects of their cultures have been obscured or even lost by way of their need to be involved in the modern world for the purpose of making a living, getting an education, and the pressure on them that's always been there to assimilate into mainstream culture. At the core of the traditional community's worldview was a deep and intimate connection with nature. Nature was sacred to them because they saw themselves as part of nature, inextricably connected. And so was the spirit of every living being. The community believed that if the young person didn't have an initiatory nature-based experience, they'd have difficulty connecting with the sacred within themselves and in the world. And without experiencing that they're a sacred being, they would never really become a mature being. And as a result, they would actually become toxic to the community. So for this reason, the community was willing to risk the possibility that the young person might not physically survive the ordeal. Usually they did survive, but sometimes they didn't. So I just like to reiterate here and summarize and give you a very important definition and summary of the rite of passage. The purpose of the rite of passage was to compel the initiate to psychologically and spiritually descend into a deeper part of themselves, some would say a sacred or divine core within, that contains not only the wisdom one needs to navigate the rite of passage, but that through the rite of passage will profoundly impact one's awareness and behavior going forward. The rite of passage is a transformational experience that alters one's experience of oneself and the world. It changes the initiate to the extent that he or she discovers a deeper, sacred layer of their humanity, and in doing so, realizes that they will never be quite the same as before the initiation. This experience also motivates the initiate to action or significantly alters actions that they're already taking. Now, let's move ahead to the 19th century. Carl Jung reframed the initiation as an experience that modern humans experience on a daily basis in the context of their Western lifestyles. He thought that any form of adversity, maybe a loss of a relationship, loss of a job, a terminal illness, a loss of a child, even the smallest losses can be forms of initiation. So the question that we're left with in reframing the myriad seas of crisis and chaos as planetary rites of passage is, how can I be a student of the crisis, of the chaos? What kind of new human being am I being asked to become? And this is what Andrew Harvey and I talk so much about in Radical Regeneration, Birthing the New Human in the Age of Extinction, which is our most recent book. What is the process? What's the actual process of navigating the initiation? What tools do we need? That's what I really want to focus on right now. It's important to understand that the process is messy and disorienting. And in the olden times, as initiates went through the ordeal, it was chaotic and often felt to them crazy-making. Some parts of the ordeal were very lonely, and they may have felt abandoned and isolated in nature. And sometimes elders were there to support them, or maybe not too far away. And at other times, the initiate was completely alone. So for us, I think that some specific tools can be useful. One of the first of these is becoming comfortable with emotions, because you're going to need your emotional wits about you increasingly as we navigate these many crises. Develop your emotional intelligence, but especially develop your emotional endurance. This doesn't mean that we don't give ourselves a break from our emotions, but that we develop familiarity with them. And one of my favorite books on this topic is Miriam Greenspan's Healing Through the Dark Emotions. I want to talk just a little bit about that right now. For example, we're all living with some form of fear as we think about climate chaos or the pandemic. We shouldn't be paralyzed by our fear, but since it's going to be with us for a long time in varying degrees, why not get to know it? I know that those of us who live in the Western United States look ahead 6 months or so, or maybe not even that long, and we think about the many fires that have taken place in the Western United States in the last 4 or 5 years. Catastrophic fires. I certainly think about it. And sometimes I just sit with it and I feel the fear in my body. And then I ask myself, what actually am I afraid of losing? My physical residence and, a community that I'm familiar with. And of course, beautiful, beautiful nature. So what does this fear prompt me to do that would actually be helpful? Well, work and prepare with my community as much as possible on many levels. And then personal preparation, insurance forms, having an escape route, and a bag packed of things that I might need. So I'm not only feeling it in my body, but I'm thinking about the actions I need to take. And then another example is grief and loss, which are and will be ubiquitous in our lives. A question I ask all of us is, are we learning the skill of grieving? For that, I urge you to the work of Francis Weller at francisweller.net and the Good Grief Network at goodgriefnetwork.org. Understand that conscious grief work is a gateway not only to coping, but to deep joy and meaning. In my experience of doing grief work with folks in my coaching and spiritual counseling practice and in workshops, I noticed that when people develop the skills of grieving, they're not only better able to cope, but paradoxically, they deepen their capacity to experience joy and beauty. That's something this culture just doesn't compute. But when you experience deep grief, especially in the support of others, with others, joy and beauty become more accessible. Another tool is understanding that in becoming a student of the chaos, the rational mind and the human ego are being shattered. And that is the direct spiritual purpose of the chaos. We need to notice what any crisis is asking us to let go of. In these many seas of chaos that we're swimming in now, how is who you thought you were giving way to becoming a different person? In many ways, in this last year, we've all become different people, and I suspect we've had some ego demolition, which is a very good thing. And one of the things that it has taught us is another tool, or I hope it's taught us because it really needs to, and that is becoming comfortable with uncertainty, as in the title of a wonderful book by Pema Chodron. Instead of asking, when is the earth going to become uninhabitable? When is the human race going to be extinct? When will the pandemic be over? Stop asking those questions. You don't know, and neither does anyone else. That's the hallmark of chaos. And if we could be certain, it wouldn't be chaos. Yet another really important emotional and spiritual tool is holding the tension of the opposites, in the words of Jung. Become comfortable with paradox. Two seemingly opposite realities can be true at the same time. In mythology and in Jungian psychology, holding the tension of opposites is mythologically and metaphorically like a crucifixion of the soul, in which it makes it possible for a third force or third option to arise, which reconciles the opposites and opens a way forward. Yet another tool, we hear the expression all the time, find your tribe. And as trite as that may be, we all desperately need allies, particularly in a time when we're physically isolated from each other. The pandemic is keeping us from our many in-person meetings, but we now have more choices for online connections than we've even had before the pandemic. Here we are in this moment together, connecting with each other around the world. And I know that many of you on this call are already allies. But if you're new to this network, use it to expand and deepen your connections. And next, I would urge everyone to work on their trauma. Trauma is a new subject now that is rising to more recognition. as we really begin to recognize the trauma, the level of trauma that we're in. We've all been colonized and we've all been traumatized. And there are many, many online opportunities for doing this kind of work. And related to that, another tool is to notice that working on your trauma cannot be separated from doing shadow work, because the shadow is partially born from trauma. But in any event, shadow work is crucial both individually and collectively, because the shadow has now erupted and gone berserk on our planet. I urge you to read in more detail about this from my book, Dark Gold, or listen to the audiobook of Dark Gold, which you can find at my website, carolynbaker.net. And then directly related to this is actively working for truth and justice, because there cannot be any peace or unity or reconciliation until the truth is told and justice happens. A lot of people right now, especially in the United States, are talking about unity and healing. But unless there's accountability and truth-telling, there cannot be any healing. Authoritarianism is increasing worldwide. And in the US, we had a fascist uprising on January 6th, and it will not be the last one. We have fascist sympathizers in our Congress. We have people in our Congress who want to kill other members of Congress. And of course, everyone's saying, well, let's just move on. We have a new administration, let's just move on. But there can be no moving on until truth is told and justice is allocated for these crimes. At the same time, everyone needs a spiritual path that nurtures and challenges them in growing their authentic, sacred self and diminishing the ego. Also, spend as much time as possible in nature. Go into nature as a sacred temple. This is part of our spiritual path. Don't go into nature as an authority, as a climate scientist, as a biologist, but go in innocently with a childlike beginner's mind and cultivate innocent intimacy with the earth community. And I come now to two of the most important questions that I've been asking folks to consider for 14 years as I've been doing this work. And to continue carrying these questions in your heart every day as a practice. Who do I want to be in the seas of chaos? Who do I want to be? And secondly, what did I come here to do? Service and activism are our moral responsibility at this time. And focus on, as you ask these questions, creating islands of sanity in a sea of chaos. When you're in the midst of the chaos, okay, where can I create sanity for myself and for those around me? And I've borrowed this terminology from Margaret Wheatley, who's an American author and management consultant and Buddhist teacher. She writes about it extensively in her latest book, Who Do We Choose to Be? She too is asking that very important question. And this is what she says. While there are very destructive dynamics at play in our civilization, as our civilization travels down the arrow of time, these dynamics do not have to wield the influence on anyone or any group that is willing to open to its environment, use its intelligence, and bravely face reality. Whenever we open rather than close, we become alive. A living system capable of self-organizing into new order rather than succumbing to disorder. The good news is that this is happening in many places, enlivened places, resisting disorder by using their hearts and minds well. And every one of them is grounded in an ethic that places people at the center of all decisions and actions. Sanity in action. So this is the message of Rumi's Guest House, and this is the work in front of all of us in the madness of the moment. I thank you all for being here today, and I'd love to take some of your questions.
Thank you, Carolyn. Splendid and comprehensive, and very much to the point of what we all need to consider. I want to encourage all of you to put any questions or comments you might have in the chat. But I'd like to start, Carolyn, by having you go a little deeper into a couple areas that you just highlighted in your main remarks. And that is the whole issue of initiation. You know, as you pointed out, you know, initiations are critically important for just the mature development of boys and girls as they move into their pubescence, into their adulthood. And normally it's a very conscious process to which they look forward to, they're guided into and assisted so that the tribe or the community ensures a happy ending and an optimized outcome. What we're in, even though people talk about it as an initiation, is something that is messy. It doesn't feel like an initiation. It feels like chaos. We've had very little preparation. There's no one really guiding us. We're not sure of the next moment, so we're unsure of how things are going to work out. So I'd like you to comment on how, at the macro level, how is this really like an initiation when there's very little connections between what we're experiencing collectively in the chaos of our own undoing and the kind of very carefully choreographed initiatory processes that have been developed over time. Just if you say, even think of the bar mitzvah in the Jewish community. I mean, they've been doing that for thousands of years, and every 13-year-old boy in the Jewish community knows that's what's coming, prepares himself, and moves through it. But we're not experiencing any of that in our world writ large, and yet people talk about it as if it's some kind of initiation. So explain more deeply how that is.
Well, I'd like to say about indigenous initiations, and I'm intellectually familiar with several of them. They were not carefully choreographed necessarily. A young person was taken out into nature, and it was wild, it was messy, it was terrifying, and they knew this was going to happen. It's not like they didn't know what they were getting into, but it was horrifying sometimes beyond their imagination. I'll give you a couple of examples. Some of you are familiar with the work of Malidoma Somé, and maybe familiar with the work of his ex-wife, Sobanfu. And they talk about their initiations in the Dagara tribe of West Africa. And Malidoma talks about being buried in the earth up to his neck for 5 days. Now just imagine being buried in the earth up to your neck for 5 days. And he said, you can feel the entire earth spinning in your body. And it's incredibly disorienting and terrifying. And the elders are around. Oh, do you need some water? Here's some food. But basically, you're on your own. So Banfu describes being hung upside down for a couple of days from a tree as part of her initiation. And yeah, they knew the procedure, but they had no idea the depth and horror of feelings that would come up for them. Mm. It was like a semi-psychotic experience. So that is what I'm talking about in terms of the similarities of our situation. And the tragedy of our situation is we have no elders. Nobody prepared us for this. No elder is accompanying us in this. We don't have a homecoming celebration to look forward to. Okay, so it perhaps is even more terrifying for us. But framing this as a rite of passage, with all of the horrible feelings and emotions of the ordeal, has been useful for me in framing what we're dealing with.
Yeah, I think that begins to make sense. In some ways, we have to, initiation is an interpretive framework, right? It's the way you're analyzing the experience that you're having. Right. You bury somebody in the ground for 5 days and there's no initiation because they're not processing it internally in that way. They're considering it a torture or they're considering it a punishment, etc. So that the challenge for those of us seeking to be more conscious is to interpret our reality at the moment, yes, as an initiatory process. So absolutely. So it's a self-induced experience.
It's a way of framing it that I'm sure that many of those folks, as they were going through their earth-based rites of passage, were feeling like they were going to go crazy and were probably raging at the elders. And what the hell do I have to go through this for? Once I get out of here, I'm never talking to you again, whatever. And so in that way, there are tremendous similarities, but it helps us to frame it, and that the whole intention is the remaking of ourselves and our communities.
Yeah, good. A couple questions that have come up. One from Dahana Rice. Her question is, what is your personal dark gold?
My personal dark gold is the shadow that I developed in my upbringing that has driven me to do deep work on that shadow and find in it the gold that is there. And I can't say it's any one thing. It's a number of things. I grew up in a Bible thumping evangelical family in the Midwest of the United States, as an LGBTQ person, and had to really liberate myself from that in the 60s when so much else was going on in the culture. And there was deep wounding as a result of all that. And I was privileged to do some deep work in Jungian therapy for a number of years, that has really allowed me to do the work that I'm doing today and be the person I am today. And that work is ongoing.
Yeah, say a little bit more about that. That's very interesting, because so many people are in the process of questioning some of their deepest identities around gender and sexuality, and that must have been particularly stark for you How old were you when you sort of became aware of this inside yourself?
Yeah, I guess in puberty, was certainly aware of it. And then I had to really keep it under wraps, of course, to be in my family. I was an only child, which made it maybe worse. Um, and even as I went to college, and I was kicked out of a Bible college because I was gay. But even as I went on to university, in the throes of all the cultural changes of the 60s, there was still this lack of permission. There's still this
Right.
homophobia culture wide until the women's movement. And then the women's movement sort of opened everything up to where we could begin exploring these different ways of being in the world. And so, we all are deeply wounded. And so in this exploration, it's very important for us not just to look to the positive of, well, I can be who I want to be, which is wonderful, but what has my wounding been? Because if the shadow isn't dealt with, then it will erupt in some way in our lives, and it will cause us to harm other people as well as ourselves.
Yeah. Well, that's a very dark, golden trauma and shadow content to work on. Thank you
Yeah,
so
and
much.
I wrote an entire book on it called Coming Out from Fundamentalist Christianity in 2006. So that's available on my website too, if anybody wants to check it out.
Yeah. Well, having had a similar missionary background in the conservative Baptist fundamentalist tradition,
Wow.
um, uh, I have very rich dark gold that I'm still working with today. So we should get together at some point, Carolyn, and compare notes.
I think that would be really a good thing.
And by the way, everyone, just to flag it, this is a very important issue. By the way, the transformation that's going on in gender and sexuality, and we're convening a course in July, between the 4th and the 10th of July, through our wisdom school, on how male and female identities are being shape shifted as the revolution in gender and sexuality takes place all around us in the world today, particularly among the young. It's a very powerful impulse. But as Carolyn says, it's shrouded in taboos and religious and conventional restrictions and shame and guilt. So, how all of us work through this is an incredibly important part of our ongoing capacity to love ourselves as ourselves changes and evolves in rather dramatic forms, having to do with the very basis of our gender and sexuality. So I thank you for bringing that up, Carolyn, and it's something that's fascinated me for many years, and we're convening a whole course on it.
Great.
And as you know, we've had several sessions on these matters during the course of Humanity Rising. We'll be attending to it again. But let me turn to another question from Una Menges. She says, "Hi, Carolyn. My question is, would you agree with me and my colleague, Helena Norberg Hodge, that to really make progress in what we are seeking to do here together, we need not only to find global community like this, but to help facilitate a relocalization of our world so that we can have more real community? And would you agree, Carolyn, that furthermore, we should put significant resources into creating such real community ourselves? That is, real communities ultimately have to be physical, not virtual. Would you agree or not?
I think that's true. I have I don't know if she's referring to intentional communities, but my experience and looking at the statistics around intentional communities, we know that 98% of them do not endure. And the reason they do not endure is people in Western culture have such a difficult time living and working with each other. And I think that's a place where the shadow that is not being dealt with, it tends to erupt and destroy things from the inside out. But I'm certainly supportive of localization, as much localization as possible, and as tight knit in our community interaction as we can be, not necessarily living together, but being physically present with each other as the pandemic permits.
Yeah, yeah, that would make sense. I mean, one thinks of the pseudo community on Facebook,
Right.
where they're telling us to, like and dislike and be friends and form community, and all the while they're commodifying everything that we're doing and selling us off as assets.
Yeah.
So this question is I think a really important one. How do we form community?
Mhm.
Humanity Rising is seeking to form virtual community.
Mhm.
And what's happening is that the larger community is spawning little sub communities, like our chat action group that has now become its own a sort of autonomous entity. And we're launching the Masters in Regenerative Action. So there's a whole subgroup that's beginning to interact. So there's like what we're developing is an ecology of communities, some virtual, some hybrid, some physical, some local, some regional, some global, simultaneously, so that our sense of community is being fractalized
Uh-huh.
in many ways. Is that your experience?
Well, I don't have direct experience with that, but it sounds absolutely wonderful. And, and the pandemic is just forcing us to do things
Yeah,
in so many different ways that we maybe hadn't even thought of in the past.
yeah, 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 yeah. Now, going back to this initiatory question for a moment, Charles Benzinger asked a very specific question. Would love to get your comment. If climate change, COVID, and white supremacy, QAnon, represent the initiation, how are we doing with meeting these challenges? How do we turn that into an initiation?
Hmm.
It's a very interesting question, Charles. Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I certainly think with COVID, I'll take that one first. With COVID, it is a direct initiatory experience, I believe, resulting from climate change. And I am not sure that COVID is going to end anytime soon as we see all these variants erupting. I'm also certain that COVID is not the last pandemic, because there's a direct connection between climate chaos and pandemics, viruses. So I think that this can be a very long and grueling initiation.
Mm.
And that's why I sort of chuckle inside when people say, well, when the pandemic is over, I'm going to do XYZ. And, I just, I'm reluctant to go along with that. There are wonderful things that we dream of and that we miss being able to do, but don't be so sure that we can do them again anytime soon. And I think we will be profoundly changed by the online connections that we've had during this pandemic time, which may, whenever it is down the line that we can connect physically, that those online connections will influence us in many ways. So COVID is definitely an initiatory experience. And of course, there's life and death right there, you know. It's an existential crisis, just as climate chaos is. And as far as QAnon, boy, there's the eruption of the American shadow. There's a civil war that we never ended, that we swept under the rug, that we never fully healed during the time of Reconstruction. And so this is profound shadow work. And, you know, I suppose I could write a whole book on how we deal with that in terms of our own shadow and healing that shadow in our culture. It is certainly an initiation that we have to look at ourselves more deeply. How, and that's why the whole, you know, the racial justice piece is so important right now. It's no accident that that has erupted at the same time as the remnants of an unresolved civil war. It's all of a piece. And I think that all of us who are not people of color need to be doing racial justice work with ourselves and with our communities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm reading a book by Emmanuel Acho called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, and finding it challenging me in very powerful ways. So thank you for raising that. Now your comment that the you know, we're not going to be out of the woods when the pandemic's over, we can expect further turbulence and escalation of crises. Dehana Rice is asking, what does your intuition tell you about the 1,000 years of peace in sacred text? You know, you think of the book of Revelation, that after the trials and tribulations and the pouring of the different vials of the wrath of God on our poor planet, then the Messiah ushers in 1,000 years of peace. What's your sense of all that?
I don't really have a sense of it, but I know what you and I were raised on, which is after that 1,000 years, Jesus is going to come back and destroy the earth. And then all of the Christians will go up to heaven, and everybody else is going to, you know, fry in hell. So that's what I know about the 1,000 years of peace from the Bible. And that is the justification that white evangelicals use for who gives a shit about the earth, you know, because God's going to destroy it anyway. It's ours to be on and procreate and use and whatever we want to do. And there'll be that 1,000 years of peace. But then after that, you know, Jesus is going to come back and destroy the earth. Not a pretty picture. So I'm not familiar with the 1,000 years of peace in any other way.
Yeah, that's the predominant depiction, certainly in the Western Abrahamic tradition. But it has to do with how we view the future, and whether we think that the dark side, the shadow, evil, can be conquered once and for all, or are we, every generation, every individual, wrestling with these issues anew? I remember when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, my mentor said to me once, you know, God has no grandchildren. And what he meant by that is that every single human being that comes into this world has to wrestle in his or her own way with the great issues of morality, ethics, spirituality, belief. And your parents simply can't pass it on to you. They can advise, they can exemplify their own particular response, but for some reason, we're not part of an evolutionary stream where morality and ethics, justice, love, peace is passed on. It's something that has to be renewed in the soul of every individual.
Yeah.
What's your view of that
Well,
perspective?
I totally agree. And it comes down to, what does it mean to be human? And what it means to be human is to be vulnerable, and vulnerable to the potential of being wounded. And that wounding creates a shadow. That's just how it is. And that shadow is either dealt with and made conscious, or it isn't made conscious, and then it goes about erupting everywhere and harming itself and other people. This is all about what it means to be human. And by the way, I have no interest in transcendence. Transcendence is part of our problem.
Say more.
Well, transcendence is a way of getting away from our humanity, a way of getting away from our connection with earth and with nature and with the soul. And it's given rise to all kinds of new age movements that are obsessed with the light and terrified of the dark. And until those two are brought together and worked with and integrated through great initiatory experiences within our lives, we miss what it means to be human.
Yeah. Well, that's very, very true. Well, I know as a parent of two young men now, 28 and 30, from the day they're born, they're their own person. And they insist, even when as a father, you want to tell them, listen, if you do this, I can tell you, they have to do it themselves. They have to, all of us need to experience the world and the anvil of our existence afresh.
Yes.
And that's the agony and the ecstasy of what it means to be human. So you're absolutely right. It has to do with our basic identity as human beings.
Yes.
This existential reality that every human being learns about him or herself and the universe afresh in an absolutely individualized way. It's like the snowflakes. There's no two snowflakes, and all the snow that's all fallen on planet Earth over the millennia, and there's no two human beings that are the same. It's one of the miracles of existence, actually.
Oh, absolutely. And when I say I'm not interested in transcendence, that doesn't mean that transcendence can't help us become more human. But for me, that's the purpose of transcendence, is to take me deeper into the depths of my humanity and that incredible, precious divine within, which is what we write about in Radical Regeneration.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question, referring back to future shock and just information, knowledge overload. What is the best approach, in your opinion, to information overload when so many disparate things seem relevant in this increasingly complex world? So many articles, videos, books to be aware of, for example. How do we deal with information overload?
Oh, I think we really have to have boundaries around that. I produce a daily news digest, which I've been producing 7 days a week for 14 years, unless I'm sick or I'm traveling or whatever. And I'm always gathering information, but I have to have boundaries around it, because the overload is just so. I'm not capable of dealing with it. So, I have to pull myself back from not knowing everything. I'm shamelessly uninformed probably about a lot of things because I just don't have the bandwidth to take everything in. So I think that's part of self-care, is pulling back and having boundaries around information and trusting that perhaps I already know, or if I don't know, that I'll be guided in my spiritual path to what I need to know. But, I think, Toffler is so right, and I read him back in the day. We, we just become dehumanized with information overload. And I want to keep my humanity.
Yeah. Well, in this regard, David Stoney is making a comment referring back again to the initiation issue, that indigenous initiations had a context well established in the living history of the tribe or the clan. Because of our abysmal ignorance of our past, most of us don't realize that our species has gone through many previous extinction-threatening times associated with the Earth's cycling climate. Such times can be seen as initiations that have made us human. In the light of the ongoing extinction-threatening event of our own making can be seen as an initiation, that we've been here before.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, that's worth commenting on, I think, Carolyn. And one thinks of, deep in the collective memory all over the world is that there was a flood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One thinks of, the mythologies around Atlantis. Right. That, once or twice or several times, humanity has gone through the eye of the needle and somehow come out the other side. There was a time when the species was down to 70,000 mating pairs.
Yeah.
And yet we made it through and came out the other side. And I think that's worth pausing on as we begin to draw the session to a close. As you know history, as you know the temper of our times, how human beings have gone through the eye of the needle before, what virtues or what practices would you offer to us today of particular salience and importance to empowering all of us during this dark time?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's the both and here, which is that we have that ancient memory, and also we've never gone through anything like this before, in real time. And so we're holding both of those. We have the capacity, we have the, our species has endured or gone through and come back. And at the same time, many, many, many human lives are likely to be lost in the next extinction. Although, as Andrew and I talk about in Radical Regeneration, we don't see that as just a purely black and white event. We see the uncertainty and we say, okay, there's also the quantum physics, a perspective of possibility, that extinction may not look exactly as we think it will. In other words, what if a number of our species and other species are made extinct? Might there be pockets of survivors? We don't know. But what if there were pockets of survivors, little pockets here and there? Number one, how would they be changed by what they've gone through? And what kind of humans might they become as a result of their surviving all of this? And what might that mean for the regeneration of the human race? We don't know. But we're not taking a black and white approach on extinction. And what we're saying is, what would you rather serve? Would you rather serve, we're all going to go extinct and it's going to be by a certain time and there's not going to be any humans left? Or would you like to serve the possibility that a new human being, a new kind of human being, is being created through this initiatory process? The outcome being less important than the process.
Yes, yes. Very good point. And David Stoney is just adding a comment, which I think is worth noting and reflecting on. He says that one of the major factors that has gotten us to the chaos of today is the fact that we have really been mimicking nature. Really? Yes. Just like any other animal that has procreative capacities, open-ended desire, and has unlimited food supply, we have continuously increased our population during this interglacial phase of Earth's cycling climate. Perhaps after the dark, unique species initiation process that may be just beginning, we can find a way to stop doing that. Whatever the case, as Carolyn has said, emotional and spiritual endurance will be required. That's worth just noting that as a species, like any species, we've spilled out as long as the environment can kind of contain us. And whether that's a bear species in the Rocky Mountain or, a fish species tend to spawn and increase until something stops them. And then once that's stopped, then the challenge of survival takes place. And it's worth noting David Suzuki's statistic that in the history of a life on planet Earth, 95% of all the species that have arisen are now extinct. So going through this eye of the needle is not a foregone conclusion and requires, on the part of every species, certainly the human species, a dexterity and a resilience at the spiritual and emotional level, in our case, that enables us to navigate through the churning waters and the crashing rocks to get through to the other side.
Absolutely. And, there's the book Limits to Growth. And there's the research of Al Bartlett, who was at the University of Colorado for a number of years. He wrote an incredible book called Overshoot. And so, nature has certain limits, and we have not been willing to live within those limits. And when you don't live within nature's limits, there are consequences.
Yeah.
Like the eye of the needle.
Yes. And well, thank you, Carolyn. It's comforting in some ways to know that we have been here before, that our species has risen and fallen and gone through unimaginable climactic, political, social, economic turbulence until we're down, last count, and somehow we've been able to rise again and persevere. And now we find ourselves on the brink of extinction yet again, and we're having to take up the challenge, I believe, as Carolyn has noted, to understand this as an initiation. And if we understand the context, that's what helps us shape the content into something that can transform our souls, our hearts, our relationships, our lives, and thereby our capacity to survive with the elegance that I think is inherent in our species. So I want to thank you for guiding us in the way that you have. You're a very wise woman, Carolyn. It's been an honor to be with you.
Just remember that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste.
That it is. And by the way, everyone, this on the 7th, this Sunday, we're having a course with Lynn Bell who's an astrologer. And if you want to take this conversation to the next level out, it's not just about what we species are doing here on planet Earth. It's about how our whole solar system interacts energetically in a way that actually shapes human behavior and spiritual development. And the year 2021 is a year that's going to be shaped in particular by the relationship between the planet Saturn and the planet Uranus. They're squaring 3 times in 2021, which indicates that one of the central themes that all of us should just expect for the next 12 months is conflict between opposites. And that's really important because, again, context shapes content. If you know that that's the context, if you know that that's the initiatory pathway, then you're empowered to take those actions individually and collectively that can ensure that you navigate through with elegance and with dignity and nobility, and are actually empowered by the process rather than victimized by the process.
Absolutely.
So I want to draw that to your attention, and I put the link in the chat box for anyone that wants to sign up. Lynn Bell is one of the great astrologers and well worth listening to. It'll be a 2-hour session this Sunday on the 7th of February. And then I want to invite all of you to our after session chat group. Again, that link will be put in the chat box. Carolyn, you're more than welcome to join, as are all of you. And then if you want to put any extended comments, videos, blogs, anything else, just go to our Ubiverse and upload what you have to say. So thank you, everyone. Tomorrow, we're going to look at a movie that's coming out called Thrive 2. And Peter Mary's going to be talking with Marshall Leffert, who's been working on a movie. It's about how we can thrive under current chaotic circumstances. So we'll be contemplating a movie tomorrow, but still on this central theme of how humanity rises with coherence in this raging sea of chaos that is our historical moment. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Carolyn. I've loved this session. You brought wisdom and deep insight for which we are all grateful.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow. Same time, same station, 5:00 p.m. Central European time here on Zoom. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Carolyn.